Hello and welcome to the Grid Podcast. We are back in our first podcast of 2024. And today we're going to do a look back at 2023 and all the change in the world of grid connections. So this is a Grid Podcast, your podcast about our electricity networks and their role at the heart of our transition to net zero. I'm Brian, hosting today as per usual, joined with David McDonald.
Hi, good to be back. 2024, here we go.
Yeah, so we were sitting down to think of topics for 2024, and basically we thought it would be good to reflect on what was a fairly hectic 2023 in the world of all things grid. And we'll share some stuff on our website that accompanies this podcast as well. If you're watching the YouTube video, we'll hopefully have some snazzy graphics post-edit as well. Just because there's so much here. You kind of need it on a page almost. So we're going to look back at 2023 and all basically the big changes that were happening in the world of grid, particularly around if you're trying to connect kind of energy transition projects, whether it be industrial electrification projects, EV charging, renewables, batteries. Batteries are going to feature heavily in what we talk about.
Yeah, it's the first year that you're really seeing that influence, and you're seeing it in policy as well.
Massive scale. And batteries are not only impacting our grid in terms of if you're a battery developer trying to connect batteries, they are having an impact across connecting just about anything else, whether it be housing developments, EV charging, everything else. So there is a bit of a theme of batteries. Batteries probably was one of the buzzwords for 2023. And as we get into it, a few of the other buzzwords you'll see here is open letters and plans, 5-point plans. A lot of working groups as well, 5-point plans, 3-point plans. There's a lot of those as well. So we'll crack into it. We'll do a bit of an overview and just sort of walk through the year, very high level, just checking in on all the different kind of things that changed and the different announcements and plans and everything else throughout the year. And then we'll just have a bit of a summary around some thoughts on it. And a bit of what we think might be the big kind of topics or fallout of that into 2024 as well.
Yeah, and some of the outworkings of it, isn't it? It's a bit of a theoretical year, and in terms of policy, I think we'll start to see that all playing through then.
Yeah, I think when we go through this, I think when we're summing up at the end, I'm gonna second guess that my summary is going to be that 2023 was really a year of planning, discussing, working groups. And I really hope that 2024 is now a year for action and actually getting stuff done. Let's see where we're at by the end of this podcast. Okay, so hopefully if you are watching on YouTube, you will now be looking at a slide called 2023 Summary, setting out a calendar of the year and a summary of some of the key happenings throughout the year, really. So just to walk anybody who's not looking at it on YouTube, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, to walk you through it then. So February, we had the update to Engineering Recommendation P2 bar 8. We're not going to get too technical on that, but that's really a lot of the planning standards, security of supply standards that DNOs consider when they're looking at your connection. So that can have a huge impact on the cost of your connection. No matter what you're connecting to the grid, that can have a massive financial impact on an energy transition project.
Or where you might want to connect as well.
Or where it might even be possible to connect. And we'll come back and touch on that in a little bit more and a bit of a look forward to P2 bar 9. Then the ESO launched their 5-point plan. And interestingly, before talking about the 5-point plan, you'll notice that if you go onto National Grid ESO's website now, National Grid isn't mentioned on there.
Yep.
They are the ESO now. And we'll touch on that later, all about the FSO, the Future System Operator. They launched their 5-point plan back around March time. Again, we'll step into some of the things that were on that. And alongside that, the ENA Strategic Connections Group issued an open letter to Ofgem as well. And I think there was 4 or 5 points in that. Yeah, I'll come back to that as well. And then in April, we had the implementation of significant code review, which we did a podcast on it probably was April last year.
Yeah, and around that.
When it came out. And that was all about two things, really. Changes to how DNOs would charge for reinforcement to connecting customers, i.e. shouldering a lot of the reinforcement costs, and then also some rules and regulations around flexible connections. And Well, effectively, in a nutshell, it's turned out pretty much as per we expect it in our podcast. So at the time, a lot of people were thinking, oh, this is a magic bullet. All our troubles are solved. And
free connections,
reinforcements are being paid for. And as we discussed at the time, we had a fairly good idea that wasn't going to be the way it would play out. And it's played out pretty much as we thought. So I would recommend going back and listening to that podcast. It's not all that straightforward. As expected, it's created a lot more complexity in the connections world. There may be a cheaper connection option now, but it might take 5-6 years, whereas there may be one that's slightly more expensive, but you could get it completed in 1 or 2 years or 6 months or whatever. So it's given a lot more optionality if you are developing a new project and adding complexity there. But overall, a good thing.
Yep.
Albeit, I think it comes up in one of the later things later in the calendar, but the flexible connection regulation maybe wasn't so great, but I will probably come back to that. The ENA launched a 3-point plan then in April after the ESO's 5-point plan in March. And then an under the radar one, G100, was updated to version 2 in April as well. And that's the regulation that kind of governs it's the technicalities if you're not exporting to the grid or you're limiting your export to the grid. So we referenced G100 in our Behind the Meter podcast when we were talking about connecting generation into like an existing industrial site or an existing demand site. Even if you're not exporting to the grid, there's still a lot of grid impact in terms of fault level and harmonics and other stuff to look out for. And G100 is the kind of technical policy about how you limit that.
I would say it's got bigger, has it?
Yeah, I can't. The original G100 was something like, I don't know, 20 pages.
30 pages I had in my head.
Yeah. And now it's been updated to like 100 odd. Or don't quote me on the exact figures. It's got a lot bigger and a lot more complicated. Basically, to allow for how different technologies have like different technical parameters.
A general theme of the policy discussions that we have, isn't it? Is that things are getting bigger and more complicated, I think, in general.
I think that's a general theme of all this move is things are just generally getting more complex, but you kind of expect that as the grid.
It's the only way it's going to have to be. Like, it's the way it's going to have to be.
As the grid gets more complex, a lot of these things are reflecting that. And then we move on to May. Ofgem set out an open letter on the connection process reform, having, sort of in response to the ESO's 5-point plan and the ENA 3-point plan, basically kind of agreeing with the theme of we need to speed up connections and we need to sort this stuff out. In June then, National Grid come out with removing the kind of non-critical enabling works for energy storage connections. So effectively saying we're going to try and speed up large-scale battery connections by not having them wait on the upstream works. So if there's a physical wire to get from the battery to the grid, you need to do that. But the upstream works will let them connect on a non-firm basis. Yep. And if
back to that flexible question again, isn't it?
Yeah, and probably won't be the first time we mention the words firm and non-firm in this podcast because they also feature heavily throughout, and we'll come back and explain that. Just a minor point, the embedded capacity registers, they lowered their thresholds to 50 kilowatts from megawatt, so you can see a lot more granularity in all the generation connected to the grid. July then was sort of kicking off discussions on technical limits. I can't remember if this was when they were implemented or when the expressions of interest opened. Either way, technical limits started to come in July and have been phased in throughout the rest of 2023. And effectively, that was an initiative where the DNOs were pushing to say, look, we need to do something. We need to start getting our customers connected. And they basically got an agreement with National Grid to sort of say, well, look, you've given us headroom for all the stuff was in the queue historically. Like, let us just use that headroom. We'll manage our connection queues at each of our grid supply points, and we can kick out some of the old connections that have been moving. We'll shuffle our queues around, get people sped up, and connect those that are ready to connect.
And we have seen a bit of progress in that, haven't we?
Yeah. Yep. So definitely seeing there was like the first batch of GSPs published across a few different DNO areas, and projects within those are starting to sort of receive letters and start to get moving. So I don't think anybody's has connected yet under technical limits, but certainly there's
wheels in motion at least.
Wheels in motion is right, and that's split into, there's a couple of phases. There's kind of the easier ones to begin with, and then there's like another phase if there's fault level issues at the GSP, or if there's two multi-users at the GSP, if there's more than one DNO, or they're in like the later phases of that. Then in August we had the Windsor report issued, which maybe touch on a bit of detail, but largely speaking, touched on the future system operator, a lot of stuff around planning consents for the big new transmission infrastructure that we're going to need, and that more kind of high level governance type stuff that you would expect from a government level report.
You can kind of see here in all of this, and we'll go on to, you'll see the next stages of these things, but you can kind of see them progressing in that way. So you can kind of see, like, here's the industry recommendation, here's the ESO recommendation, here's the support from Ofgem, here's now a Wisner report in terms of planning, and then there'll be stuff we'll touch on shortly. You can kind of see it just growing and building in terms of, like, everybody's going the same direction, which is probably, I'm not saying a first, but it feels like we're all on the same page for once.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Obviously some of the criticism from people trying to get projects connected and off the ground will be it's maybe not happening fast enough for them. But I genuinely think if you were comparing the UK to other countries across the world, you probably find that there's a lot of momentum here. There's a lot of joined up thinking, as you were saying. Like when I was talking about the ESO's 5-point plan, ENA's 3-point, and then Ofgem's, a lot of that all had the same kind of theme behind it and the same goals and aims. So
I think, as you say, that the proof of the pudding will be in the eating and all that good stuff, like 2024 year of action as opposed to year of consulting.
Yeah,
I think that's where we need to see it out working. We can't be slow in implementing some of this stuff.
I think that's probably right. August as well. Then Ofgem launched a consultation on the LTDS, and that's the long-term development statement. So it's all about how DNOs publish their data. So again, lots of kind of some new stuff in around that. September, we had the Prime Minister's speech on net zero, again just reinforcing some of that stuff around, and we're going to move away from first come first serve grid connections process, and quite significant connection reform. And again,
and that's a new first ready first served. Is that the kind of new term that they're going to?
That's rough. I think that's the term they've coined. And then obviously for us involved in all things grid, it's not often it gets kind of airtime at Prime Minister level. So it just shows you how significant all this is becoming.
Yep.
And then at the same time, we had the National Grid Connection Strategy, and we'll come back to that as well. But a lot of that is around publishing data. They're talking about publishing more geospatial data on their connection queues and stuff like that, which should be really useful actually. And there's some stuff around trying to speed up connections and everything else. And in October, Energy Act got royal assent. So that is the piece of legislation that sets out the FSO, the Future System Operator, and I think basically sets out that the ESO, National Grid ESO, should transition into government ownership at some point in 2024. And as I said earlier, it's interesting, like the branding of National Grid's already off their website. They're clearly already readying themselves for that transition. And then November actually was a busy month. So we had Ofgem and DESNZ's Connection Action Plan. So DESNZ being the old BEIS government department. So the government department that sort of sits above Ofgem. So they both released the Connection Action Plan in November. We had a Transmission Acceleration Action Plan as well. Public charge point regulations come into play as well. Yep. So around uptime for EV public charging, which is interesting as well. And then we also had Ofgem approving powers to National Grid to terminate people in the queue. So again, as part of National Grid's action plan, a big part of that was to try and whittle out all these speculative projects, implement milestones, and actually force projects that aren't moving, get them out of the queue. So
we touched on that last year in the podcast, didn't we, as well? And like the capacity crunch or whatever, around transmission being gummed up.
Yeah, exactly. So that's actually come through and been rubber stamped by Ofgem as well. Just to we'll maybe touch in a couple of these quickly, but I think there's probably a lot to just step
There's
back.
so much there really is. I think it's having a quick overview, I think, and then, where we think we're going.
Yeah, exactly. So I think probably for this podcast, probably the overview is just enough to take in. As I say, we'll publish a bit of a roadmap of this on the website or on the YouTube along with the podcast, just to give people a summary. It's a good kind of calendar of events if you're kind of looking to try and trace back what was going on last year or trying to pick something out. The one thing that's not on there actually, there was also a lot of work on P28 around voltage change. Again, that's another one we expect to see some stuff in 2024. That's quite important for batteries as well.
And that's really to do with how quickly they come on and off and the effect that they have on voltage, really, isn't it?
Voltage swing, yeah. And I did say at the start, we did say that batteries would feature heavily, and I probably didn't pull that out. But in a lot of those action plans focused around the network modeling for batteries.
Well, having been an 11 kV planner, probably don't want to say 20 years ago, I think it is now. It's going to be a bit of it's a pretty complex world now that you're living in. Before it was quite a straightforward, too strong a word, but you had standard rules, and I think the way everything's going to have to be flexibly connected. I think it's a whole different ball game now how the network runs, and that's what we need to do to utilize the network to the best of its ability. And as long as everybody knows how they're connected and the connection arrangements they have, there shouldn't be a problem. It's just the guy that has to do the 11 kV study might have a bit more of a headache. But that's the world we're in.
So obviously we have National Grid taking a different approach to modelling batteries at transmission level, assuming higher attrition rates, assuming less owners, the battery's not importing at max import times, things like that. We've then got the DNOs looking at the likes of P28 and standardising how they do the technical voltage swings for batteries. And as well, we have when I said P28 there, that was P28. We've got P2 bar 8 moving to P2 bar 9 at some point in 2024, looking at how DNOs model batteries on their networks.
I think one of the big changes there in the P2 bar 9 is probably that bit around what you have to include in group demand. I think batteries are going to hopefully be stripped out of that. So that'll make a huge difference in terms of hopefully freeing up capacity.
Well, if you ask me, one of the kind of big things for 2024, we are seeing, so the DNOs have allocated firm import capacity, and I use that word firm. It's getting quite contentious in the industry. But anyway, which is now blocking the likes of EV charging or industrial or even housing sites getting connected from the grid, which is not a good news story. Battery developers do not want to be there. They want to be seen as part of the solution to grid congestion, but the way the capacity has been allocated to them is causing further congestion at distribution level.
It really is the DNOs getting up to speed with how you should actually model a battery. And I suppose some of the, if you go back a bit of the legal ramification of how it's, what's in the connection agreement, what are people entitled to, but all that element. But it now is up, it now feels like it's getting up to speed, and that should hopefully then release
capacity. Exactly. So I'm seeing quite a few projects where currently held back because there's no upstream capacity on either the DNO's network or the transmission system operators network. But hopefully with the revised modelling rules that both National Grid, or the ESO, I should be calling them, are bringing in, and then hopefully we'll see that kind of update on P2 bar 9 to allow the DNOs to do the same. Should release a lot of capacity across the country, and hopefully unlock a lot of like EV charging, industrial electrification, and large scale housing projects as well. So that's probably one of the key things kind of that I'm interested in for 2024. Obviously all that transmission reform really to kind of removing speculative projects, accelerating ones that are there, just changing the whole model and emphasis. That's all going to be impactful. Again, that's all going to take a while for National Grid to work through as well.
And the industry to get its head round. And, I think that there'll be challenges in that, no doubt, in terms of some of the legislation that's available to them to apply and the approval of that. And then, well, how's that going to work for my project, or how does it not work for my project? All those things will be asked. But it's the right way to go, and it's the stuff that we've been calling for as an industry, I think.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so there's going to be a lot of stuff for project developers to take account of here, because as things get more complex, there's more risk with their connection and things like that as well. So
yeah, and has there been any update just around that sort of curtailment modelling as well? What's the crack there?
Yeah, so I mentioned on the SCR, the Ofgem regulate it for flexible connections, which was good, and basically set out that, kind of trying to standardize across all the DNOs how they offer flexible connections. But effectively then it went to, I think, DACUSA to come up with a DACUSA mod or whatever, to basically put that, codify how they would do that. And effectively, I think that ended up having to be, they had quite a tight time frame. Ofgem gave them a notice quite late in the day. They had a couple of months or whatever. So the way that's been set up is, it's really onerous, really conservative. If the curtailment in reality is actually like 5%, the methodology that actually is set out in the codes probably calculates it at like 50%. So it's not really meaningful to anybody really. Yeah. So yeah, I think that needs modified in some shape or form. Yeah. That would be my opinion on it.
Well, it feels very conservative, doesn't it? And you can understand that, because there is. You have to stand over that kind of mod now, don't you, in that study as well.
And I know some of the DNOs have been frustrated by this too. So I actually think there's a live consultation from UKPN at the minute on curtailment assessments to do with curtailment modelling and everything else. So I know the DNOs have recognized, because the algorithm in the code, DACUSA, it does not calculate curtailment right. The algorithm isn't right. Yeah, it just clearly doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It ignores certain constraints that you should be including, and all sorts of things, without going down a rabbit hole. So to be fair, again, I think we've seen some action on that in a way. I know certainly UKPN, I'm aware of. There may well be other DNOs looking at how they can do that in a better way as well.
Because that'll be a step forward too. Because people, the whole point of that is to inform people. And it's not to be to the nth degree of, well, actually, I was at 7.1% curtailment, and you told me it was going to be 5. It's kind of in bands, isn't it? It's like, how risky is this project, and you need a realistic view of that as opposed to a conservative one.
Yeah. Well, look, we might come back in part 2 of the podcast and jump into some of these things just in a little bit more detail, just to set out some of the content. But I think maybe to wrap up in terms of part 1, let's maybe pick 3 summary points out of it. So I think number 1 for me is the stuff around battery modelling. So obviously we've seen National Grid set out their stall. They're trying to get that changed. And I'm hoping the DNOs will update how they're doing things. So I know that the DNOs have said any new battery connections is going to be on a non-firm basis for the import capacity. But I really would like to see the change to P2 9 come in, so that we can retrospectively remove batteries out of modelling for other demand projects to proceed. That's one for me. I suppose second big one, I'll be interested to see how the whole FSO transition works out, the future system operator, because they do have a hand in pretty much everything here. Distribution connections are all reliant on them now. They obviously have a massive say in pretty much everything that goes on in the system. And
your third
one. What will any for you standing out, David?
Well, for me, it's maybe more just that I think, we always try to give a very balanced view in this podcast, I hope. But for me, it is that we are on the right trajectory. Everybody is together. You're seeing all the people line up, the DNOs, National Grid, you're seeing Ofgem come in behind it, you're seeing a Prime Minister speech, you're seeing Royal Assent of the Energy Act. It just feels like we are on this journey. We have a lot to do to get to net zero, but you can see the energy behind that. No pun intended there, actually. Yeah. But there is that energy to push on. Next year is going to be an interesting year politically, probably too. So we'll not pass any comment on that. But just in terms of this stuff is going to form part of that whole campaign and where we go and how are we recovering the UK economy, and hopefully the stuff that we've already seen here can really look to do that and provide a boost for us.
Yeah, so that's everything for part 1 of this podcast. We'll come back in part 2 and we'll just delve into some of those key events from 2023 in a little bit more detail to just give you a bit more flavour of what was in some of those 5-point plans, 3-point plans, strategies and speeches.
And again, look, if you're listening and there's a particular thing you want to hear about more of and that look forward and what we present back, tell you, give us a shout, drop us a note on the...
And the only thing I know for definite is we will not have everything covered in this. Like, there was a lot of stuff in 2023. So do feel free to point out to us, like, if there's anything key that you think we've missed that you'd like to summarize, comment on. And yeah, do feel free to reach out. So yeah, we'll just wrap it up there. We'll come back in part 2, but do subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, to look out for part 2. And we will be back shortly.
See you again.
Thanks.
Cheers.